So we're going to try something new on the screen today, so bear with us until we just make sure it's working. So who is Jesus? I've got a little video just to show.
I think that he's a man with long hair and he's God's son. Yeah, true. Yeah.
I don't know. I've never seen him or anything like this, and I don't really believe in him.
I think Jesus is fictionary.
I think Jesus is probably a guy that's made up to try and keep people in line.
To be honest, he's part of the biggest con ever to be associated with mankind.
I think that Jesus is something that people have in their imagination and that they use to kind of comfort themselves in sort of difficult situations, maybe.
I think a person called Jesus existed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think he's a little bit crazy.
He's important, but for young people like us,
Yes.
I don't know. Il est important pour toi, Jésus?
No.
My best friend, for her, Jesus is a big factor in her life and her making decisions.
So there's so many different religions, you don't really know what to believe, and nothing's wrong, but it's Jesus real, because there's so many different things you can believe in.
Who is Jesus?
So millions of people know about Jesus. Millions of people believe in Jesus. But how do you know what to believe and what is right and what is not? When a Christian says they believe the gospel is a word for sort of good news. When we believe the good news about Jesus and we say it's true, what do we actually mean and how do we know? What is the evidence, if there is any, for Christianity? Is Jesus really just a myth? Did he even exist? Well, we're going to think about some of those things today. I think there is evidence for the fact that a person called Jesus did exist at the time, we think, in Israel. But what do you then do with that information? Well, we'll see in a minute or two. So there is evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. There were two Roman historians, Tacitus and Suetonius, and they both speak about him. Josephus, it says, writing very close to the time that Jesus was alive, he says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works. A teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then he goes on to speak about the fact that this Jesus was crucified, and subsequently people alleged that he had been resurrected. So outside the Bible, there are people who speak about Jesus and something about the story that we would say is there in the gospel and the good news of Jesus. But there's also evidence inside the New Testament. When I was a police officer, you used to have to go and get witness statements from people, and you wanted people who had actually seen the thing happen. And so people say, well, the Bible was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote hasn't been changed over the years? Well, there's a thing that academics call textual criticism. And that actually, when we look at it in a minute, we see it means that we can be fairly confident that over the years, what has been written has stayed the same. Professor F.F. Bruce from the University of Manchester wrote a book called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And in it he shows how, just in sheer volume, sheer weight of numbers, the manuscripts that there are about Jesus and the New Testament are far greater than other similar historical works. The idea behind textual criticism is this. You sit and read a book that's a copy of an ancient manuscript, and you start by asking two questions. How soon after the original was the earliest copy made? So after the events happened, how soon was the first copy written? And then, how many copies are there? Well, we've got some up there. You see, Herodotus' Histories was written in the 5th century. That's a gap of about, I can't read that from here, 1200, 1300 years. Caesar's Gallic War was a 950-year gap between the original and the copy. Livy's Roman History, there's a 900-year gap between the original and the copy. Nobody would argue that these are reasonable and use them in terms of history. Now, what about the New Testament? Well, the books of the New Testament were written between 40 and 100 AD, and the earliest copies we have begin in 130 AD. We have full manuscripts by 350 AD. So depending on how you look at it, at most, there's a 300-year gap, and at least it would be 30 years. And if it's 30 years, then the possibility is that the people who wrote the first one are still alive and can say, that's not right. And what about the number of copies of each? Well, Herodotus' histories, there's 8 copies in existence. Caesar's Gallic War, there's 10 copies. Livy's Roman history, there's 20 copies, but you can see there in the New Testament, there are 24,300 copies. That's a significant difference. 5,309 Greek, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 other. There's no comparison between these books. So there is evidence that Jesus existed, but who was he? What was he? Teacher? Prophet? What can we know and tell about him from our history? Firstly, we know that Jesus was human. The Hollywood movie director Martin Scorsese made the film The Last Temptation of Christ to show that Jesus was a human being. But for most people today, that's not really the issue, that even if Jesus did exist, then we accept that he was human. We understand that he had a human body, that he could be tired, he could be hungry, he could suffer pain, he could have human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experience. He was born, he grew up, he was educated, he was tempted, he suffered, and so on. And so many people would say, yes, Jesus was human. That's absolutely okay. We don't dispute that. But that's all he was. He was a great religious teacher, perhaps, but no more than that. Just a man. In fact, Billy Connolly, the Scottish comedian, says this: I can't believe in Christianity, but I think Jesus was a wonderful man. He was a great religious teacher, kind of like Buddha or Gandhi. But there are other views of Jesus. The rock star Bono was asked, Christ has his rank amongst the world's great thinkers, but Son of God, is that not a bit far-fetched? And Bono replied, no, it's not far-fetched to me. Look, the secular response to the Christian story always goes like this. He was a great prophet. Obviously a very interesting guy. But you see, Christ doesn't allow you that. He doesn't let you off that hook. Christ says, I am God incarnate. So what you're left with is either Christ was who he said he was, or he was a complete nutcase. I'm not joking here. The idea that the entire course of civilization for over half the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase, for me, that's far-fetched. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, you have to ask, who did he think that he was? And people will say, well, he never actually claimed to be God, and that's true. He didn't go around saying, yes, I am God. But when you look at what he did say, and when you look at what he did, then you can reasonably come to that conclusion that he was aware that he was more than just a human being. The first thing to think about is his teaching was about himself. Most good religious teachers will point away from themselves to God or to something else. They don't point to themselves. They don't say, look at me, I am God. But Jesus, in pointing to God, actually was pointing to himself. In every human heart, there is an emptiness, there's a hunger. And 3 leading psychologists of the 20th century recognized this. Jung said people are hungry for security. Alder said people are hungry for significance. Freud said people are hungry for love. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you want those hungers satisfied, come to me. Many people are today, they're suffering from depression, disillusionment, despair. For many people, it's kind of like an emotional darkness. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. People today are frightened of death, and we try to avoid talking about it even. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live even though they die. Somebody asked Mother Teresa just before she died, are you afraid of dying? And her answer was, how can I be? Dying is going home to God. I've never been afraid. On the contrary, I'm looking forward to it. Many are dissatisfied with materialism and what we're supposed to gain in the world. And they're searching for some kind of spiritual reality into which Jesus says, I am the way. When you're searching for some kind of value system, Jesus says, I am the truth. People ask, what's the point of life and what is its meaning, what's its purpose? And Jesus says, I am the life. Others in the past have said, that's the way, or that's the truth, or that's the life. But Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And then he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus said that to receive him was to receive God. He said to welcome him was to welcome God. He said to have seen him was to have seen God. And he makes indirect claims. He says things that, although are not direct claims to be God, they show that he regarded himself as being in the same position of God. In Mark chapter 2, there's a story of friends who take a man who was paralyzed, and he's on a mat, and they cut a hole in the roof of the building where Jesus was, and they lower him down, and Jesus speaks to him, and part of that conversation he says, your sins are forgiven. And in that day, in that context, what he was saying is, I am God, because I can forgive your sins. We can forgive people who have hurt us, but we can't forgive somebody who has hurt somebody else. That doesn't make sense. Only God can forgive in that way. And when Jesus claimed there to have the authority to be able to forgive anybody, the religious people accused him of blasphemy. And they said, who can forgive sins but God alone? And then Jesus claimed he was going to be the one who would judge the world. He tells the story at the end of Matthew's Gospel, and he says, you're going to see me sitting on my throne, and I'm going to separate you into sheep and goats. He said that one day all the nations would be gathered before him, and he would make the decision according to how we have responded to him in this life. Now, that's not the kind of thing that a great religious teacher would say. Suppose you came into church on Sunday morning and I stood here and said, one day I am going to judge the world, and your response and your future in that regard will relate to how you have responded to me during my life. Now, you might choose to believe that. I wouldn't recommend it, but you might. I suspect you'd be more likely to be looking for the door. Great religious teachers don't do that. They don't say that. And then there's his actual direct claims. In John chapter 20, he has come back from the dead. The disciples are gathered together in their room because they're terrified, and Jesus appears to them there, all except one, and his name was Thomas. Just imagine him coming back, and they're saying, oh, Jesus was here, and Thomas goes, aye, right. Could have been a Scot, couldn't he? Aye, right. Imagine how he must have felt. He wasn't there when Jesus turned up. Jesus, who was supposed to be dead in the grave. Now, Thomas is a classic 21st century skeptic. He said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to believe that until I see it for myself. I need to see the wounds in Jesus' hands and his side, or I'm not going to believe. And then subsequently, Jesus appears to all of them, including Thomas. And he shows Thomas the wounds in his hands, his feet, and his side. He allows Thomas to ask his questions and express his doubt right up close and personal. And you know, we all have questions about faith and about God. And as I say, over the next few weeks, we're going to look at some of these issues together. And that's why we have these sheets with the questions on them. Just to take time to think, either yourself or with friends during the week or after the service. Now, we may not get a physical body to touch, but we do get testimony. We do get people who saw it and were there. Jesus says to Thomas, here you are. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas's response is this: my Lord and my religious teacher? No. My Lord and my God. And Jesus doesn't say, Thomas, you're wrong. Don't even say that. Actually, what he says is, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. In other words, what he's saying is, at last, Thomas, you have been really slow to catch on, but you're there now. And these claims were not just for the disciples. Everybody around it at the time was aware of them. In John chapter 10, verse 30, we read this. Jesus says, I and my Father are one. And again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him, and Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which one of these do you stone me? And they said, we are not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Jesus of Nazareth did claim to be God. But that's not the end of the argument. All sorts of people make all kinds of claims. The fact that somebody claims something doesn't in itself make it right or true. There are lots of people around the world, some in psychiatric hospitals, who are equally deluded. They think that they're Napoleon or Elvis Presley or somebody else. Some of them even think that they are God. But they're not. How do we test such people's claims? How do we test Jesus' claim? Well, there are three possibilities. Either, number one, it was not true, and Jesus didn't realize it was not true, therefore, he was deluded or insane. Number two, it wasn't true, and Jesus knew that it wasn't true, making him a liar, an imposter. And number three is that it is true, that he really was and is God. C.S. Lewis puts it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane or something worse. But don't let's come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. I think there is evidence to support what Jesus said, the first of which is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that has ever come from anybody's lips. The Sermon on the Mount is quoted by loads of people through history. Love your neighbour as yourself. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Jesus' teaching has become the foundation for entire civilizations. Much of the law that we have today is based on teaching that comes from God's Word and from the teaching of Jesus. We're making progress in every field of science and technology. We travel faster, we know more. But in 2,000 years, this teaching that Jesus gave still holds true, and nobody has been able to better it. And so you have to ask, is it likely that that would have come from somebody who was insane or evil. And then what about his works? Sometimes people, and sometimes quite rightly, say, oh, church is boring, Christianity is boring. But that's something you couldn't really say about Jesus. I suspect he must have been one of the most extraordinary people to be around. Imagine going to a party with Jesus. This is the first miracle that is recorded. He goes to a party and they've run out of alcohol, they've run out of wine, and people are getting a bit agitated. And so he turns water into wine. That's my kind of miracle. Do you know? I think that's all right. But you go to a party with Jesus. He didn't sit there with a long face. It doesn't tell us that. It doesn't say that when people were dancing, he was there scowling. He was there. He was involved. He was part of what was going on, involved in what's going on. Imagine going on a picnic with Jesus. People are so excited to hear what he has to say and see what he is doing that they forget to take their food. All apart from one wee boy. And Jesus takes that food and blesses it and feeds more than 5,000 people. Imagine going to a funeral with Jesus. Jesus went to a funeral once. And to everybody's surprise, he said, take that stone away from the tomb. And they went, but he's been in there for days, he'll be stinking. And Jesus said, take the stone away. And then he said, Lazarus, come out. And his previously dead friend came out of the tomb. What a great funeral to go to. We might think Christianity, we might think religion is boring, but Jesus is not boring. It's not just his miracles, but his love. He continually reached out in love to those people who were outcast in society. He went to the poorest of the poor. He went to those people that nobody else would go to, and he loved them. The lepers, the outcasts, the prostitutes, the tax collectors. And in doing that, their lives were transformed. And he's still doing that today. And then there's his character. His character has impressed millions of people over the years, people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christian. The famous US magazine Time, it called Jesus the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western thinking. Supreme unselfishness, but never self-pity. Humility, but not weakness. Kindness, but not indulgence. The British journalist Matthew Paris, who describes himself as an avowed atheist, writing in the magazine The Spectator, says this: I've got such huge respect for Jesus because his life was so radical. It was so inconvenient. If Jesus hadn't existed, the church would never have invented him. Jesus was an extraordinary, radical figure with an extraordinary character. And of course, the real test is when we're under pressure and when we're in pain. And Jesus, in excruciating pain, hanging on the cross, said about the people who were doing it to him, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. His enemies could find no fault in him, and his friends said, this man has no sin. And then there's the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one in the history of the world ever had a book written about them before they were born. Even lots of books written before they were born. For example, in the Old Testament book of Micah in chapter 5, written around 700 years before he was born, we read the prophecy that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, and in the Gospels we see that prophecy fulfilled. And it's not just one or two prophecies. In total, Jesus fulfilled over 350 prophecies that were written years, sometimes hundreds of years before his birth. And in one day, Jesus fulfilled 29 of them. Now you could say, well, maybe he read the Old Testament and then he went out of his way to make sure that he did all of the things that were written there. The trouble with that is that many of them were things that he had no control over. Many of the things were about how he was going to die, about where he would be buried, about his resurrection. Even the place of his birth was foretold, and that's quite difficult to manipulate. Then there's his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. The writer and atheist Richard Dawkins says, If the resurrection is not true, then Christianity becomes null and void, and I absolutely agree. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we are wasting our time. The New Testament theologian N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, puts it like this: the Christian claim is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that creator is to be seen in terms of and through the lens of Jesus. So what is the evidence that the resurrection actually happened? Well, one, you have Jesus' absence from the tomb. There have been many theories over the years to explain why Jesus' body was not in the tomb on that first Easter morning, and none of them are particularly good. First of all, it's been said that, well, maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He fainted from the pain and then recovered in the coolness of the tomb and got out of the grave clothes, pushed away the stone, and ran away. Well, I think that's just ridiculous. Jesus had undergone a Roman flogging. The bones were poking through the skin. He was literally in tatters, his body broken. Then he'd been crucified, and most people didn't survive Roman crucifixion. His body was cocooned in heavy grave clothes and placed in a tomb cut out of the rock. A stone weighing about 1.5 tons was rolled in front of the tomb. Not easy to move at the best of times, and certainly not on your own, especially when it was being guarded by a troop of Roman soldiers. There's also a very interesting piece of evidence in John chapter 19, verse 33. It says, when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they didn't break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, today we know that this indicates there's a separation of the clot and the serum in the blood. It's strong medical evidence that Jesus was already dead, and they didn't understand that in those days. And so they wrote that it came out like water. Other people have said, well, maybe the disciples came along and stole the body, and they began the rumor that Jesus was risen. Well, leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, the theory is a bit improbable simply from a psychological perspective. These men were depressed, they were defeated, they were disillusioned, they'd put all their hopes in Jesus, and now he was gone. They had nothing to live for and nothing to hope in. And yet something did happen that totally transformed their experience and their lives, so much so that subsequently most of them were willing to suffer and die themselves. Many of them would be tortured and executed because of their faith in Christ. I find it difficult to believe that people would give up their own lives for something they knew to be a lie. Others have said, well, maybe the authorities stole the body, but that's absurd, because all they had to do then was produce the body when people started saying he had risen from the dead. But they never did. Others have said, well, maybe robbers stole the body. But the thing is, the only thing of any value in the tomb was the grave clothes that Jesus was buried in, and the spices that were there. And yet the only thing that was left in the tomb was the grave clothes. In fact, we're told that when John, Jesus' friend, looked into the tomb and saw the clothes there, it was at that moment that he believed. Then you've got his presence with the disciples. After rising from the dead, Jesus appeared many times to them and to others. Some people have said, well, that was just a hallucination. And of course people do hallucinate. Normally people that hallucinate are quite highly strung, highly imaginative, very nervous or sick or on drugs. The disciples don't really fit into that category. We're talking about fishermen who used to hard work, fishermen, tax collectors. We're talking about realists and cynics and skeptics. Thomas, who said, no, I don't believe that until I see it for myself. And then the number of people who saw Jesus after his crucifixion, more than 500 on 11 different occasions. And then you've got the nature of those appearances. Hallucinations are subjective. They have no objective reality. We would not all see exactly the same thing, and yet these people are saying exactly the same. It's like seeing a ghost, but that's not what they see and say in Luke chapter 24. It says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost, and he said to them, why are you troubled, and why did doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, and they still didn't believe. Because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. Jesus ate food with them. He cooked breakfast for them on one occasion, and he had long conversations with them. All of this had an immediate effect on them. It transformed them and resulted in the birth and explosive growth of the Christian church across the globe. Well, what is it that caused that, if not the resurrection? And then we have Christian experience down the generations. Why many of us are here today. Billions of people down the ages have experienced Jesus Christ. People of every colour, every race, every tribe, every continent, every nationality, from every economic, social, intellectual background, unite in a common experience of Jesus. It cannot be a hallucination. Is anyone here in love? Well, if not, you could go and research it. You could do a degree. You could even go so far as to do a PhD on being in love. You could speak to leading experts in being in love. But unless you are actually in love, it's all academic. You don't really understand it until you yourself have experienced it. The experience is essential. And my own experience of faith, just like millions of Christians through the years, is an experience of the presence and love of God in my life. I have experienced his grace and his mercy. I've experienced his forgiveness. I've experienced his love. I've let him down time and time and time again, and have experienced his forgiveness as he has accepted me back time and time and time again. He speaks into my circumstances. He helps me, he guides me, and things that I should do and where I should go. He gives me a meaning and a purpose for my life. And that's what convinces me every day that he is alive. So in conclusion, in the light of what Jesus claimed about himself, there are three possibilities. Either he was insane, or he was evil, or he really is God. There's a quote attributed to the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And so we look at evidence about what Jesus taught, about what he did, about his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead. Surely we can eliminate as impossible that Jesus was insane. Surely we can eliminate as impossible that Jesus was evil. So what's left? Well, that he was who he said he was, the Son of God. C.S. Lewis puts it like this: when we are faced with a frightening alternative, the man we're talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane or worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. We're going to sing. It's a song about the greatest day in history. It's a song about the day that Jesus was crucified and resurrected. It's a day that changed everything.